Hello.
Hello. This is my weekly power up because I get to see Amy and talk to Amy. It's amazing.
Same here. Love you too.
Welcome everyone to Empathy Power Up, your weekly dose of empathy to get us through the week and really get some new lessons and growth as we go week to week. We wrapped up an amazing March with some incredible women. That was amazing, right? Like, I loved it.
Yes, it's lovely
I
to
know it
talk.
was a leading question, but
No, thank you. Yes.
I I I learned so much from that. And Amy, you brought today's topic to us. I would love for you to introduce it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for listening in and being here, everybody. Um, so this topic of boundaries, which is the topic we're covering all month long in April. Um, it actually happened because I was interviewed recently for a podcast, and it was talking about being a highly sensitive person, an empath, and having empathy as my biggest strength. And I talk about the difference between the three. I'm not going to talk about that in this session, but one of the questions that the interviewer had for me was this question around boundaries, and she said, "How do you find the boundaries you need to be a sensitive, receptive, caring person without getting flooded all the time?" And so that was that was one of those things, and I'm like, I should probably have a good answer for this. And to tell you the truth, it's really hard. And so I went and dove a little bit deeper into some of the resources that I have and the books that I have. And I thought that the work around boundary setting is something that other people might want to learn from.
Mm.
As I was learning about it, why don't we just share it on the show? So that's kind of how it came to be.
Yeah, and I love this. And I think that's how you framed it is so important is when we practice empathy and when we're compassionate, when we are just being, boundaries are a thing that we aren't thoughtful about, we're not as aware about we understand some societal boundaries through laws and policies and ethics, but even then, as we know, as we've seen in the world through history, those boundaries aren't real boundaries, and so it then leads to us not having those. So I think it's such an important topic, and I love that question. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing this to us, and and including me and our community into this journey.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was doing my research, I came across this amazing quote from Adam Grant, which speaks to the power of boundaries. And this is a conversation I've been having with many of my friends and colleagues recently. So Adam Grant says, when people overstep, it's not always because they don't respect your boundaries. Often it's because you haven't drawn your boundaries. So if
Mm.
you don't tell them what the line is, how can they learn or stop crossing it? And I just got back from a wonderful like leadership retreat where I realized that for most of my life, because I was taking care of so many people around me and being a people pleaser, that I very, well, it's not like I never, but I very often don't think about what do I want and sit with what I want and say, these are the things that I want, and being open about it. Right. And I think it's especially important, being a highly sensitive person and an empath, to be able to have those boundaries and to figure out what that is. So does that quote from Madam Grant about setting your boundaries resonate with you?
Yeah, I think it's very important to to like it resonated a lot, and I've been thinking about like what it made me do is like, have I been explicit about my boundaries with the people I
Mm,
love or the other people, or what is my reaction? And it's such a, and I invite that reflection to each of us: is are we setting those
mhm.
boundaries? So we're going to dive deeper into this so that we can give the
Yes.
tools and we can learn the tools of how to set boundaries, how to maintain boundaries, what are the boundaries, all of those
Mhm.
things, right? So it resonated a lot, and I'm
Mhm.
excited to dive in deeper because, um, like there one example of a boundary that I very explicitly set that comes to mind is one where I don't like I don't bring work to my cell phone, and
Oh, okay, okay.
like no email, no
That's good.
Slack. It's not going to be on my mobile phone. I
Mhm.
communicated that to my team. I communicated that to my
Mhm.
leadership, to my
Mhm.
bosses, and everyone. And I said, you can still text me and call me.
Mhm.
That's
Yes.
the thing.
Yes. Yes.
And it's been over a year in this role, and I've been living that. It's like, wow, I love this. This is incredible.
You can decompress and you can separate the two. Yeah.
And I'm not constantly like checking Slack or checking email
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like I'm like, I'll get to it when it's time.
Yeah. That's such an important boundary. And I think that's a great place to start, right? Of like figuring out, when you talk about work boundaries. And that's actually a big topic we're going to be having at this week's Healing from Dysfunctional Workplaces talk. It's also a theme we're bringing into our bi-weekly check-ins. And so we have a support group. It's called Healing from Dysfunctional Workplaces. It's a bunch of people who have been harmed in some way by really dysfunctional, a lot of dysfunctional workplaces, which, let's be honest, most of us have been in. And so that kind of led, on top of that podcast that I was on, led me to kind of take this entire month and just go dive deeper. And then as I'm going on this journey, like I want to learn from other people and learn from you, and also go deep and be like, what are my boundaries? And figure out like how do I make sure I'm living those boundaries? Because I think Brene Brown says that the most empathetic people are the people who have the most boundaries.
Ah, very interesting.
So
Yeah, I love that. So,
yeah.
do you want to dive in deeper into what are the
Yes.
different types of boundaries?
Without further ado, halfway
Yeah.
into our session today. So the couple of the resources that you might want to dive deeper into that I have in my world that I'm going to be reading from or bringing this work from is this book called Complex PTSD Workbook by Dr. Ariel Schwartz. I've been doing this work book with a friend. I'm open to say that I have CPTSD is called complex PTSD. It is pretty much a bunch of different experience PTSD like experiences, traumatic experiences that has led you to be who you are today. So I'm trying to understand myself through the experience there. And when I thought about boundaries, this is a topic that I'm actually have come to in this part of this journey when I'm doing this book. And so they say a couple things. So this Ariel talks about having a boundary is an aspect of self-respect that allows you to assert your no and your yes. Without
Hmm.
a boundary, you're more likely to give in to others because you long for approval. Maintaining successful boundaries involves accepting the fact that you cannot please others all of the time. Boundaries are also meant to be flexible enough to allow for intimate connections with others.
Hmm.
And healthy boundaries require that you tolerate both closeness and separateness.
Hmm.
So,
Very interesting. I like how it starts with like our need for approval, and I think that is something that's common. No matter who we are, we seek either approval from ourselves or parents or anyone, and I think it is an interesting way to get to and what you shared. So I love that.
mhm. Yeah, and I just went out with one of my best friends earlier today, and we were sitting with the fact that many years ago when I was doing my own healing journey, I started thinking about I laugh because it's like Jiminy Cricket talks about let intuition be your guide. And Jiminy Cricket's from Pinocchio. I don't know if people remember that. And and that song that he sings, and which I haven't watched Pinocchio in a long time, but it's kind of a mascot for me because
Mm.
in a way, for you to understand your boundaries, understand your intuition, as your gut is telling you. And so often, like I was saying earlier, we don't sit with those thoughts about, okay, what do I want? And like and I think about, especially as that empath part, is like, where does my boundary end and another person's begins? Sometimes I just absorb what other people need or want. And that's not good for me, right?
Yeah.
And I abandon myself the more I do that, right? And not listen to myself. So that's a big part of this work. So
it is. And the more you're sharing, the more it's creating like more reflection opportunities for me to be like, okay, what are the other boundaries that I may have intentionally or unintentionally set in my life? And some are coming up. So I love this this journey, because I think when we practice empathy as leaders, as a people manager, at a boss, all of these things, there are boundaries that we need to maintain. And because it's not just for our protection, but it's also for the protection of the people we're helping, or the people we're trying to understand and listen, because we want to give them the space and agency and empowerment to make their own choices, to sit with their feelings as well. So I think that's really great, really important.
Yeah. And part of this like certification program that I've been working on around self-care and self-carefully is really about, how do you model self-care for yourself, but then also the people around you, to know, okay, what does that mean? What are the boundaries that I set in myself and others? So that others can set their boundaries and feel empowered to set their boundaries, so we know how to care for each other. And that's the word that I think about. Care is that word that I think boundaries can get us to.
Absolutely. Like an extreme example of this, and I'm using an extreme to help understand, make it simpler, is if I was a nurse or a doctor, and I'm trying to help someone and I'm trying to care, maintaining boundaries is a way to care. Protecting myself, wearing a mask, wearing a suit if they have an infectious disease, or it's how we communicate, how we understand, and make sure that we maintain a boundary of objectivity in helping them as well. So I think it's an extreme example, but look, that's a very important boundary that the medical professional demands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we would call a physical boundary.
Okay.
And there's actually multiple different kinds of boundaries that I'm finding out. I also, as we were talking through this the other day, it was so funny that I was just like looking over in the corner here, and I have for you don't see it here, but I got a bunch of books like you do, but it's my book thing. And I was like, oh man, this book was like jumping out to me. So it's this book called Unfuck Your Boundaries. Build better relationships through consent, communication, and expressing your needs. This book stood out to me when I was living in San Francisco in 2020. And I was like, boundaries was resonating back then for me too. And I picked up this book, and I read it, but I decided to come back to it. And so in the book, I'm going to read from a couple things about what they say, and paraphrase in a little bit here. But this was written by Faith Harper. Well, Dr. Faith Harper. She's got a lot of letters behind her name. So, but she has also wrote the book Unfuck Your Brain too. So
I've heard of both these. Yeah, very impactful. Yeah,
exactly. So she talks about different types of boundaries. The first one is physical boundaries, and these are the boundaries that deal with the pragmatics of touch: when, where, how, who, etc. Both of others touching you and you touching others. And so the story I wanted to share here is that I had to set a boundary growing up with my father, because my father's love language is touch, or was touch, because he passed away. And he would always love to hug. And anybody who's actually seen me in person has probably received one of my hugs, and everybody's like, you have the best.
I am looking forward to that, by the way.
One day you will get a massive bear hug from me. And it's not too long, it's not too short, it's exactly right. It's kind of like Goldilocks. And something I take pride in, that I got that hugging from my father, right? So I'm really proud of this hugging. But I remember growing up that my dad would actually come and hug me without my consent, right? He
Mm.
would come and just like hug me, and it's just like, and it didn't feel right, right? Like looking back on it, I just was like, I felt weird, didn't feel great inside, right? Because it was like he's just taking and not me giving consent. So over time, as I got older and started understanding that feeling that I had to say, hey, Dad, can you please let me know, ask me first if I want to be touched or hugged. And so that was setting that boundary with my father. And, obviously standing up for myself was something that, helped our relationship.
Thank you for sharing that story. Really vulnerable and an amazing representation of the physical boundary aspect. And I had a similar conversation even as recently as my husband, because
Mm-hmm.
there with your spouse, boundaries are very different, right? And especially
Yes.
around physical aspects.
Uh-huh.
And so I recently realized that I have a need for touch. Like I want
Mm-hmm.
touch. And so part of that conversation I had with my husband of meeting that need was, what about you? Where can
Mhm,
I, it was a
mhm.
conversation we had around that boundary as well.
Yeah,
And I love this. I think I know we're at time, but I really um,
yeah.
invite everyone to reflect on what are
Mhm,
your physical boundaries. Have you set some
mhm.
boundaries intentionally? We're going
Yeah.
to dive into the other types of boundaries
Mhm.
in the coming
Yeah.
month, but I think it's an first one. Let's take the physical one, let's understand it, and let's set
Mhm,
what are the
mhm,
physical boundaries. And now with this whole remote work, that
mhm,
could be another physical
mhm.
boundary that we're thinking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. And I think one more that I think I would add, I think there's six or there's seven of them. I would think that one that comes along with that too is when we talk about physical boundaries, is property boundaries.
Mm.
Right, because physical and property can be kind of
Oh
confused
yeah.
sometimes, but property boundaries are the boundaries that deal with the things that we own or laying claim to, like our homes, our bikes, our favorite
Mhm.
T-shirts. So that's something there, and I remember having siblings, right? A lot of times, like you don't want to share this. Like I hated sharing things because I would always feel like I would get the short end of the stick. So I think that's something to think about too. Is that like when you think about physical boundaries, it's about like touching you and others, but then property boundaries is the things you own and what you want to do and how you want to share those things.
Yeah, yeah, I love that one. I think that's an important one, and we can dive in deeper into the property one as we kick off the next one. I'll
Yeah,
leave it
yeah.
with this last story. Growing up, what and still to this day, one thing I hate is when someone splashes water in my face. I hate it.
I hate
It
that.
it's just one of the worst feelings I get. And you know those Disney rides where you're in the 4D experience and then they
Yes.
spray water at you? I hate that. But
Okay.
I had told my brother, I hate it, don't do it. And every damn day he continued to do it. I feel like even till this day, he'll do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And so this is an example where, and that impacted our relationship.
Mm, mhm.
And so I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
having boundaries and then respecting that boundary when it's been
Yes.
communicating
Yeah.
can build and make the relationships connection stronger.
I think we can have a whole conversation about like respecting boundaries, but then also reinforcing boundaries and making
Right.
sure that people keep to those
Yeah.
boundaries.
Yeah. I
Um,
think we will. I'm loving this.
yeah,
So
we'll get there. So,
thank you for bringing this. I'm really excited. This is going to be fun journey of
mhm,
learning and growth. And thank you, Amy,
of
for
course,
that.
anytime.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see
Hmm.
you next week with more
Yep.
boundaries. Our boundary is going to be, we're going to dive into more of the types of boundaries and then talk each
Hmm.
about them. And then, as Amy said, we'll talk about respecting boundaries and maintaining them, and
Hmm.
then how to apply some of those tools in our lives.
Yes, absolutely. See you next week.